From the mist-covered hills of ancient Celts to the bustling streets of modern Dublin, the story of Ireland spans thousands of years of triumph, tragedy, resilience, and rebirth. This Emerald Isle has witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the arrival of saints and scholars, the devastation of conquest and famine, and the fierce determination of a people who refuse to let their spirit be broken. But how did this small island on the edge of Europe become home to one of the world's most distinctive cultures? And what forces shaped the island we know today? The tale we're about to unfold isn't just about dates and battles, though there will be plenty of both. It's about the extraordinary human drama that played out across these windswept landscapes for millennia. We'll witness the arrival of the very first inhabitants who crossed treacherous seas to reach these shores. The Golden Age, when Ireland was known as the land of saints and scholars. The devastating invasions that changed everything, and the long struggle for independence that would inspire liberation movements around the world. By the end of this journey through Irish history, you'll understand how a small island nation produced some of the world's greatest writers, revolutionaries, and emigrants who carried Irish culture to every corner of the globe. You'll discover why the Irish language survived against impossible odds, how potato fields became the stage for one of history's greatest tragedies, and why the shamrock became more than just a plant. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how Ireland's history defies simple categorization. This is a land where pagan druids and Christian monks coexisted, where Viking raiders became Irish kings, where Norman conquerors became more Irish than the Irish themselves, and where centuries of oppression forged an unbreakable national identity. Our story begins in the depths of prehistory, when Ireland was a very different place than the green paradise we know today. Around 33,000 years ago, during the last ice age, Ireland was a frozen wasteland covered by massive glaciers. The sea levels were much lower, and what would become the Irish Sea was merely a river valley connecting Ireland to Britain and continental Europe. No human had yet set foot on this icy landscape, as the conditions were far too harsh to support any form of human habitation. But as the ice began to retreat around 15,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. The land that had been buried under kilometers of ice slowly emerged, scarred and carved by the glaciers, but ready for life to return. Rivers formed from the melting ice, forests began to grow, and animals started to migrate across the land bridges that still connected Ireland to the rest of Europe. The first creatures to arrive were the hardy survivors of the Ice Age. Giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet roamed the emerging grasslands. Brown bears lumbered through the developing forests. Wild boar snorted through the undergrowth. Wolves howled across the valleys. But still, no humans had made the journey to this new land. That would change around 12,500 years ago, when the first human beings finally reached Ireland's shores. These weren't farmers or city builders, but hunter-gatherers who lived by their wits and their intimate knowledge of the natural world. Archaeological evidence suggests they arrived via Scotland, island hopping across the narrow straits during low tide or crossing on primitive boats. Who were these mysterious first Irish? They belonged to what archaeologists call the Mesolithic culture, and they were remarkable survivors. Picture small bands of perhaps 20 to 30 people, carrying everything they owned, following the migrations of animals and the seasonal availability of plants, nuts, and shellfish. They had no metal tools, no agriculture, no permanent settlements, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable, an unmatched ability to read the landscape and adapt to its rhythms. These first inhabitants established base camps along the coasts and rivers, particularly around what is now Dublin Bay and the River Shannon. They crafted sophisticated tools from flint, wood, and bone. Their fishing spears were works of art. Their hide boats were marvels of engineering, and their knowledge of edible and medicinal plants was encyclopedic. They lived in temporary shelters made from wood, hide, and brush that could be quickly assembled and dismantled as they moved with the seasons. For over 4,000 years, these Mesolithic people had Ireland almost entirely to themselves. They developed a deep spiritual connection to the land, believing that every hill, river, and grove possessed its own spirit. Their shamans interpreted dreams and omens. Their storytellers preserved the oral traditions that would later influence Irish mythology, and their craftspeople created the first distinctly Irish artistic styles. But around 6,000 years ago, everything changed with the arrival of Ireland's first farmers. The Neolithic Revolution, as historians call it, didn't happen overnight in Ireland. Instead, it was a gradual transformation that would fundamentally alter the relationship between humans and the Irish landscape forever. The newcomers brought with them revolutionary technologies: pottery, polished stone axes, domesticated animals, and most importantly, seeds for wheat and barley. These Neolithic farmers were part of a great wave of agricultural peoples spreading across Europe from the Middle East. They looked different from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, with darker hair and eyes, and they brought with them not just new tools, but an entirely different way of thinking about the world. Where the hunter-gatherers saw the land as something to move through and adapt to, the farmers saw it as something to shape and control. The transformation they wrought on Ireland was nothing short of miraculous. Using their polished stone axes, they began the monumental task of clearing Ireland's dense forests. Tree by tree, grove by grove, they opened up the landscape for their crops and livestock. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats were introduced to Ireland for the first time, forever changing the ecosystem. But these weren't just simple farmers scratching out a living from the soil. The Neolithic Irish were sophisticated engineers and astronomers who created some of the most impressive monuments in human history. Their greatest achievement was Newgrange, a massive passage tomb built around 5,200 years ago that predates both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid of Giza. Newgrange isn't just a tomb, it's a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering and astronomy. The massive circular mound, 80 meters across and 13 meters high, contains a precisely aligned passage that allows sunlight to penetrate to the central chamber only during the winter solstice. For 17 minutes each year, a shaft of golden light illuminates the chamber where the cremated remains of the ancestors rest, symbolizing the triumph of light over darkness and the promise of spring's return. The construction of Newgrange required not just enormous labor, but sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. The builders had to understand the movements of the sun and stars, calculate precise angles and alignments, and coordinate the work of hundreds of people over many decades. The massive stones that form the passage were quarried from sites dozens of kilometers away and transported without wheels or beasts of burden. This wasn't an isolated achievement. Across Ireland, the Neolithic people built hundreds of megalithic tombs, stone circles, and ceremonial sites. At Carrowmore, in County Sligo, they created one of the largest complexes of megalithic monuments in Europe. At Polnabrone in County Clare, they erected a haunting portal tomb that still dominates the limestone landscape of the Burren. These monuments tell us that Neolithic Ireland was far from a collection of isolated farming communities. Instead, it was a sophisticated society with complex religious beliefs, advanced technical skills, and extensive trade networks that stretched across Europe. Irish-made stone axes have been found in England, while exotic materials like amber from the Baltic and jadeite from the Alps have been discovered in Irish tombs. The Neolithic farmers also developed Ireland's first distinctive artistic traditions. Their pottery was decorated with intricate geometric patterns that would influence Irish art for millennia. They carved spirals, diamonds, and zigzag patterns into the stones of their monuments, creating an artistic language that spoke of their understanding of natural cycles, astronomical phenomena, and spiritual beliefs. But perhaps most importantly, The Neolithic period established patterns of Irish life that would endure for thousands of years. The reverence for ancestors embodied in their great tombs, the intimate knowledge of the landscape required for their farming, the communal effort needed for their monuments, and the spiritual connection to the cycles of nature all became fundamental aspects of Irish culture. Around 4,500 years ago, as the Neolithic period reached its peak, Ireland was home to perhaps 100,000 people living in hundreds of farming communities scattered across the island. They had transformed Ireland from a wilderness into a managed landscape of fields, pastures, and settlements connected by a network of tracks and waterways. Yet change was coming once again. Across Europe, a new technology was spreading that would revolutionize warfare, agriculture, and society itself. The secret of metalworking had reached Ireland's shores, and with it came the dawn of the Bronze Age. The transition to the Bronze Age in Ireland began around 4,500 years ago, with the discovery and use of copper. The first Irish metalworkers learned to extract copper from ore using intense heat, then shape it into tools and weapons that were superior to stone in almost every way. Copper axes could fell trees faster than stone. Copper awls could pierce leather more easily, and copper knives held their edge longer than flint. But the real breakthrough came when Irish smiths learned to alloy copper with tin to create bronze. This required not just technical skill, but extensive trade networks, since tin was rare in Ireland and had to be imported from Cornwall, Brittany, or even Spain. The fact that Bronze Age Ireland could maintain these long-distance trade relationships tells us that Irish society was becoming increasingly sophisticated and well-organised. The Bronze Age Irish weren't content with simple tools. They became master craftspeople who created some of the finest metalwork in prehistoric Europe. Irish gold ornaments from this period, including the famous Glenansheen collar and the dozens of lunulae found across Ireland and exported throughout Europe, demonstrate a level of artistry that wouldn't be matched for centuries. These weren't just beautiful objects, they were symbols of power and status in an increasingly hierarchical society. The ability to afford bronze weapons, gold ornaments, and exotic imports marked the emergence of Ireland's first elite class. Chiefs and warriors were buried with magnificent bronze swords, axes, and spears, while their wives and daughters wore intricate gold jewelry that proclaimed their families' wealth and connections. The Bronze Age also saw significant changes in Irish settlement patterns and social organisation. The scattered farmsteads of the Neolithic period gave way to larger, more permanent settlements, often protected by earthen ramparts or wooden palisades. These hill forts and promontory forts, positioned on defensible heights or coastal headlands, suggest that Bronze Age Ireland was becoming a more violent and competitive place. Warfare was clearly becoming more common and more organised. Bronze Age weapon hoards found across Ireland contain hundreds of swords, spears, and axes, often deposited in bogs or rivers in what appears to be ritual offerings to the gods. These weapons weren't crude tools, but sophisticated instruments of war, with perfectly balanced swords designed for both cutting and thrusting, and spears with wickedly barbed points designed to inflict maximum damage. Yet Bronze Age Ireland wasn't just about warfare and competition. This was also the period when many of Ireland's most enduring cultural traditions began to take shape. The elaborate burial rituals, the reverence for water and high places, the complex mythology that would later be recorded in medieval manuscripts, and the sophisticated oral traditions that preserved knowledge across generations, all have their roots in Bronze Age Ireland. The period also saw remarkable innovations in agriculture and land management. Bronze Age farmers developed new crops, improved their livestock through selective breeding, and created field systems that maximized agricultural productivity. They built the first roads and bridges, established regular markets and fairs, and developed systems of law and governance that would influence Irish society for centuries. Most intriguingly, Bronze Age Ireland appears to have been connected to a wider European world in ways that challenge our assumptions about prehistoric isolation. Irish amber beads have been found in Mycenaean Greece, Irish gold in Germanic tombs, and Irish bronze weapons in Scandinavian hoards. Irish smiths were clearly aware of technological developments across Europe and quick to adapt foreign innovations to Irish conditions. As the Bronze Age reached its peak, around 3,000 years ago, Ireland was home to perhaps 200,000 people living in a complex society that combined local traditions with international connections, agricultural innovation with military competition, and remarkable artistic achievement with practical technological advancement. But on the horizon, another transformation was approaching that would prove even more dramatic than the arrival of farming or metalworking. The knowledge of iron-making was spreading across Europe, and with it would come new peoples, new languages, and new ways of life that would shape Ireland's destiny for the next 1,000 years. The stage was set for the arrival of the people who would give Ireland its name and establish the cultural foundations that endure to this day, the Celts. The arrival of the Celts in Ireland around 2,500 years ago wasn't a single dramatic invasion, but rather a gradual infiltration that would transform the island more profoundly than any previous cultural shift. These weren't just new people arriving on Irish shores. They were the carriers of a revolutionary technology, a complex social system, and a rich cultural tradition that would define Irish identity for millennia to come. The Celts brought with them the secret of iron-making, a technology that would revolutionize every aspect of Irish life. Iron was abundant in Ireland's bogs and mountains, unlike the rare tin needed for bronze, which meant that for the first time, high-quality metal tools and weapons could be produced locally and in large quantities. An iron sword was not only superior to bronze in hardness and durability, but it was also far more affordable, democratizing warfare and changing the balance of power across Irish society. But the Celtic migration wasn't driven by conquest alone. These were people fleeing pressure from expanding Roman power on the continent, seeking new lands where they could preserve their ancient ways of life. They came in waves, some as warriors seeking territory, others as craftspeople and farmers looking for opportunity, and still others as refugees displaced by the great upheavals sweeping across Europe. The Celts who reached Ireland were already a diverse people, speaking related but distinct languages and following varied customs shaped by centuries of migration across Europe. Some came from Gaul, bringing with them the sophisticated political structures and military tactics that had impressed even Julius Caesar. Others arrived from Britain, carrying traditions that blended Celtic culture with influences from the Mediterranean world. Still others traced their ancestry to the Hallstatt and Latin cultures of Central Europe, the heartlands of Celtic civilization. What united these diverse peoples was more than just language or technology. The Celts shared a worldview that was both mystical and practical, reverent and warlike, sophisticated and elemental. They saw the natural world as alive with spirits and magic, but they also possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and natural science. They valued poetry and music as highly as skill in battle, and they created a society where warriors, druids, and craftspeople all held positions of honor and respect. The Celtic conquest of Ireland was neither swift nor uniform. In some regions, the newcomers seem to have arrived as a ruling elite who imposed their language and customs on existing populations. In others, there appears to have been gradual cultural assimilation, with Bronze Age Irish communities adopting Celtic ways through trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many areas, the transition was so gradual that it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when Celtic culture became dominant. What emerged from this complex process was a uniquely Irish form of Celtic civilization. The Celts who settled in Ireland developed their own dialect of the Celtic language family, which would eventually become Irish Gaelic. They adapted their continental social structures to Irish conditions, creating a distinctive form of tribal organization based on extended family groups called tuath. Most importantly, they synthesized their own traditions with those they found already present in Ireland, creating a culture that was both recognizably Celtic and unmistakably Irish. The Ireland that took shape during the Celtic period was organized around perhaps 150 small kingdoms, each ruled by a ree or king who claimed descent from the gods themselves. These weren't absolute monarchs in the later European sense, but rather war leaders and judges who ruled with the consent of the free warriors of their tribe. Above the local kings were provincial kings who claimed authority over multiple tuath, and above them, at least in theory, was the ardri or High King, who ruled from the sacred hill of Tara in the heart of Ireland. Celtic Irish society was complex and highly stratified, but it was also remarkably fluid by the standards of the ancient world. At the top were the kings and nobles, the flaith, who owned the land and commanded in war. Below them were the free farmers and craftspeople, the sail, who formed the backbone of society. At the bottom were the slaves and bondsmen, the mug, who had no legal rights but could sometimes earn their freedom through service or skill. But Celtic Ireland also recognised categories that had no equivalent in other ancient societies. The Druids, Brehons, and Fili occupied positions that transcended the normal social hierarchy. Druids were priests, judges, teachers, and keepers of sacred knowledge who could travel freely between warring kingdoms and whose persons were considered sacred. Brehons were legal experts who memorized and interpreted the complex web of customary law that governed Celtic society. Fili were poets and storytellers whose satirical verses could destroy a king's reputation, or whose praise could elevate a warrior to legendary status. This was a society that valued intellectual achievement as highly as physical prowess. A master poet held the same social rank as a king, and a skilled craftsperson could earn wealth and status that rivaled those of nobles. Knowledge was power in Celtic Ireland, but it was knowledge that had to be earned through years of rigorous training and demonstrated through public performance. The Celtic transformation of Ireland wasn't limited to social organisation. These new arrivals brought with them revolutionary technologies that changed how people lived, worked, and fought. Celtic smiths didn't just work iron. They created alloys and techniques that produced weapons and tools of extraordinary quality. Celtic farmers introduced new crops, improved ploughs, and rotational systems that increased agricultural productivity dramatically. Celtic craftspeople worked in materials and styles that created some of the most beautiful objects ever produced in ancient Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the Celts brought with them a rich tradition of oral culture that would preserve and transmit Irish history, law, religion, and literature for over 1,000 years. In a society without writing, memory was everything, and the Celts developed sophisticated techniques for preserving vast amounts of information in verse, story, and song. The great Irish myths and legends that we know today, the tales of Cuchulainn and the Tyne, the adventures of Finn and the Fianna, the tragic love story of Deirdre and Nawise, all have their roots in this ancient oral tradition. Celtic religion was equally complex and sophisticated. The Celts worshipped hundreds of deities, from great gods like Lugh and the Dagda, who controlled the fundamental forces of nature, to local spirits who inhabited specific hills, rivers, and groves. Their religious calendar was tied to the agricultural year and the movements of the sun and moon, creating festivals like Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad that marked the changing seasons and honoured the gods who controlled the fertility of the land. The Druids who served these gods were far more than primitive priests. They were the intellectuals of Celtic society, trained in astronomy, medicine, law, history, and philosophy. Their education took 20 years to complete and involved memorizing vast amounts of sacred knowledge that could never be written down. They could predict eclipses, perform surgery, settle legal disputes, and compose poetry that was believed to have magical power. Celtic Ireland was also a warrior society where courage in battle was the highest virtue and death in combat was considered the most honourable fate. Celtic warriors fought with long iron swords, spears, and shields, decorated with intricate patterns that proclaimed their owners' status and achievements. They rode to battle in horse-drawn chariots, fought naked or nearly naked to show their contempt for death, and took the heads of their enemies as trophies. But Celtic warfare wasn't random violence. It was governed by complex rules and rituals that limited destruction and preserved social order. Wars were often fought according to agreed-upon rules, with single combat between champions sometimes deciding the fate of entire kingdoms. Cattle raiding was considered a legitimate way for young warriors to prove their courage and win wealth, but it was conducted according to strict protocols that prevented it from escalating into total war. The landscape of Celtic Ireland was dotted with impressive fortifications that served both military and ceremonial purposes. Hill forts like the massive Dún Aungasa on the Aran Islands or the spectacular Grianan of Eileach in County Donegal weren't just defensive structures, but symbols of royal power and sacred spaces where the gods were honoured and the ancestors remembered. These sites often incorporated much older megalithic monuments, suggesting that the Celts recognised and respected the sacred geography established by their predecessors. Celtic craftspeople created objects of extraordinary beauty and sophistication that rivaled anything produced in the classical world. The La Tène style that characterised Celtic art across Europe reached its highest expression in Ireland, where smiths and jewellers created masterpieces like the Broita gold collar and the Petrie crown that combined technical perfection with artistic vision. These weren't just decorative objects, but sacred items imbued with spiritual power and social meaning. Trade and cultural exchange flourished in Celtic Ireland despite its reputation for warfare and isolation. Irish gold, silver and bronze objects have been found across Europe, while exotic imports like amber from the Baltic, glass from the Mediterranean, and silk from the Far East found their way to Irish archaeological sites. This suggests that Celtic Ireland was part of a sophisticated network of exchange that connected it to the wider world. As Celtic civilization matured in Ireland, it developed characteristics that distinguished it from its continental cousins. The Irish Celts maintained their independence longer than any other Celtic people, never falling under Roman rule, and thus preserving ancient traditions that disappeared elsewhere. They developed a distinctive artistic style that would later influence medieval European art, a unique form of social organisation that balanced individual achievement with collective responsibility, and a rich literary tradition that would eventually be recognised as one of the great literatures of medieval Europe. By the time Celtic culture reached its peak in Ireland around 2,000 years ago, the island was home to perhaps 500,000 people living in a complex society that successfully combined pastoral agriculture with sophisticated craftsmanship, local autonomy with broader cultural unity, and ancient traditions with constant innovation. The stage was set for Ireland's next great transformation, one that would come not through conquest or migration, but through the arrival of a revolutionary new idea that would change everything: Christianity. The Ireland that would soon encounter St. Patrick and his fellow missionaries was already a sophisticated civilization with deep roots and strong traditions. How that ancient Celtic world would adapt to and transform the new Christian faith would determine the character of Irish culture for the next 15 centuries and create the foundation for Ireland's golden age as the land of saints and scholars. The arrival of Christianity in Ireland wasn't a sudden thunderbolt, but rather a gradual dawn that would illuminate the island in ways no one could have predicted. Long before St. Patrick set foot on Irish soil, whispers of this strange new religion had already reached the ears of Celtic chieftains through trade routes that stretched across the known world. Roman merchants spoke of a god who had died and risen again, while British slaves captured in raids told stories of miraculous healings and divine forgiveness that seemed to defy everything the Druids taught about the natural order. The Ireland that Christianity encountered in the 5th century was ripe for transformation, though not in the way anyone expected. The old certainties were beginning to crack under the weight of changing times. The Druids, those keepers of ancient wisdom, found their authority challenged by new ideas flowing in from the continent. Young warriors returning from raids in Britain brought back more than just cattle and gold. They carried tales of Christian communities that seemed to possess a different kind of strength, one that didn't depend on sword and shield. Into this world of uncertainty stepped a man whose very name would become synonymous with Ireland itself. Patrick wasn't born Irish. He was a Romano-British youth who had been captured by Irish raiders and spent 6 years as a slave herding sheep in the hills of County Antrim. During those long, lonely years watching over his flock, something profound happened to this frightened young man. He experienced what he would later describe as a divine calling, a voice that spoke to him in dreams and visions, preparing him for a destiny he could never have imagined. When Patrick finally escaped his captivity and returned to Britain, he might have been content to forget about Ireland forever. But the voice that had sustained him during his slavery wouldn't let him rest. In a dream, he saw a man named Victoricus approaching from Ireland with countless letters, and as he read the first one, he heard the voice of the Irish people themselves crying out, "We beseech thee, holy youth, to come and walk among us once more." The Patrick who returned to Ireland around 432 AD was no longer the terrified slave boy who had fled years earlier. He was now an ordained bishop, trained in the sophisticated theology of continental Christianity, but he possessed something far more valuable than mere book learning. He understood the Irish mind and heart in ways that no foreign missionary ever could. He knew their language, their customs, their fears, and their dreams. Most importantly, he knew how to speak to them not as a conqueror, but as someone who had shared their struggles and understood their pain. Patrick's approach to converting Ireland was nothing short of revolutionary. Where other missionaries might have demanded the complete destruction of pagan traditions, Patrick chose a different path. He didn't tear down the sacred groves. Instead, he built churches beside them. He didn't condemn the ancient festivals. He transformed them into Christian celebrations. He didn't reject Celtic art and poetry. He baptized them and turned them into vehicles for spreading the gospel. The famous story of Patrick, using the three-leafed shamrock to explain the Trinity to the High King at Tara, captures this approach perfectly. Whether the tale is historically accurate matters less than what it represents. Patrick's genius lay in his ability to take familiar Irish symbols and invest them with Christian meaning. The shamrock wasn't just a plant anymore. It became a sacred symbol that every Irish person could understand and embrace. But Patrick wasn't working alone in this great transformation. Other missionaries, both before and contemporary with him, were already laying the groundwork for Christianity's triumph in Ireland. Palladius had been sent by Pope Celestine in 431 to minister to the Irish believing in Christ, suggesting that Christian communities already existed before Patrick's arrival. Other saints whose names have been largely forgotten by history were establishing monasteries, converting chieftains, and training the first generation of Irish Christian leaders. What made Irish Christianity unique wasn't just Patrick's missionary methods, but the way Irish society itself shaped and moulded the new faith. The Celts had always been a spiritual people who saw the divine in every aspect of the natural world. They didn't abandon this mystical approach when they became Christians. Instead, they infused Christianity with a Celtic sensibility that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine, the sacredness of creation, and the thin boundary between the earthly and heavenly realms. The conversion of Ireland proceeded with remarkable speed and thoroughness. Within a century of Patrick's arrival, the old pagan temples had been abandoned, the Druids had either converted or fled, and Christianity had become the dominant religion of the island. But this wasn't the brutal conversion at sword point. that characterized the Christianization of other parts of Europe. The Irish embraced the new faith with an enthusiasm that surprised even the missionaries themselves. Part of this enthusiasm can be explained by Christianity's appeal to different segments of Irish society for different reasons. For the kings and nobles, Christianity offered connections to the wider European world and access to the learning and culture of the Roman Empire. For the common people, it provided hope for a better life after death and protection from the arbitrary power of both earthly and supernatural forces. For the intellectual class, it opened up vast new realms of knowledge and philosophical speculation that complemented rather than contradicted their existing interests in law, poetry, and natural science. The Irish monks who emerged from this conversion weren't pale, bookish hermits removed from the world. They were robust, adventurous men who combined intellectual rigor with physical courage, scholarly pursuits with practical skills, and deep spirituality with worldly engagement. They established monasteries that became centers of learning, agriculture, craftsmanship, and commerce. They copied manuscripts, developed new artistic styles, and created educational systems that would influence European culture for centuries. The monastic movement that swept across Ireland in the 6th and 7th centuries was unlike anything seen elsewhere in the Christian world. While European monasticism emphasized withdrawal from the world and strict hierarchical control, Irish monasticism was characterized by intellectual curiosity, artistic creativity, and missionary zeal. Irish monasteries weren't just places of prayer and contemplation. They were universities, hospitals, workshops, and hostels all rolled into one. The great monastic centres that arose during this period, Clonmacnoise on the Shannon, Glendalough in County Wicklow, Clonard in County Meath, became magnets for students from across Europe. Young men travelled from England, France, Germany, and even Italy to study in Irish monasteries, earning Ireland the title of the Island of Saints and Scholars. These weren't just theological schools, but comprehensive centres of learning where students could study everything from astronomy and mathematics to medicine and natural philosophy. Irish monks revolutionised the art of manuscript illumination, creating masterpieces like the Book of Kells that combined Christian themes with Celtic artistic traditions in ways that had never been seen before. They developed new forms of poetry and prose that would influence European literature for centuries. They made advances in astronomy, mathematics, and natural science that were far ahead of their time. Most importantly, they preserved and copied classical texts that might otherwise have been lost forever during the chaos of the early medieval period. The Irish Church that emerged from this remarkable period was distinctly different from the Roman Christianity that was developing on the continent. It was more decentralized, with abbots often wielding more power than bishops. It was more flexible in its practices, maintaining some Celtic customs that Rome considered irregular. It was more scholarly, with an emphasis on learning and intellectual achievement that sometimes put it at odds with the anti-intellectual trends in other parts of Europe. These differences would eventually lead to conflict with Rome, but in the early centuries of Irish Christianity, they were sources of strength rather than weakness. Irish Christianity's unique character allowed it to appeal to the Irish temperament in ways that a more rigidly Roman form might not have done. It preserved elements of Celtic culture that might otherwise have been lost while transforming them into vehicles for Christian expression. The success of Irish Christianity wasn't confined to Ireland itself. Irish missionaries, filled with wanderlust and evangelical zeal, set out to bring their unique form of the faith to the rest of Europe. St. Columba established the monastery of Iona off the coast of Scotland, which became the base for converting the Picts and the Anglo-Saxons. St. Columbanus travelled to Gaul and Italy, founding monasteries and challenging corrupt practices wherever he went. These Irish missionaries, known as peregrini, or wanderers for God, carried with them not just the gospel, but also the learning and culture of their homeland. They established scriptoriums where classical texts were copied and preserved, schools where European students could receive an education superior to anything available in their own countries, and centres of artistic production that influenced the development of medieval European art. The impact of these Irish missionaries on European culture cannot be overstated. They helped preserve classical learning during the darkest centuries of the early medieval period. They established educational institutions that would evolve into some of Europe's greatest universities. They developed new forms of art, literature, and scholarship that would influence European culture for centuries. In many ways, Irish monks were responsible for keeping the flame of learning alive in Europe during what would otherwise have been an age of intellectual darkness. By the 8th century, Ireland had become the intellectual centre of Western Europe, a position it would hold for several centuries. Irish scholars were sought after in the courts of Charlemagne and his successors. Irish manuscripts were treasured in monasteries across the continent. Irish artistic styles influenced everything from architecture to jewellery design throughout medieval Europe. But this golden age of Irish Christianity was built on foundations that were both strong and fragile. The very decentralisation and independence that had allowed Irish Christianity to flourish also made it vulnerable to external threats. The monasteries that had become centres of learning and culture were also repositories of enormous wealth in the form of gold and silver religious objects, manuscripts, and treasure donated by grateful converts. As the 8th century progressed, reports began to reach Ireland of strange ships with striped sails appearing off the coasts of Britain and northern France. These vessels carried warriors unlike any the Irish had ever encountered, men who worshipped different gods, followed different customs, and showed no respect for the sanctity of Christian holy places. The Vikings were coming, and their arrival would test Irish civilization in ways that no one could have anticipated. The island that awaited the Viking longships was at the height of its power and influence, a land of magnificent monasteries, renowned scholars, and artistic achievements that were the envy of Europe. How this Christian Celtic civilization would respond to the challenge of these pagan sea raiders would determine whether Ireland's golden age would continue or whether it would be remembered only as a brief flowering before a long, dark winter. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in Irish history, a clash between two very different worldviews that would reshape the island forever and create the Ireland that would emerge into the medieval world. The first Viking raids on Ireland came like thunder from a clear sky on a summer morning in 795 AD. The monks at Rathlin Island off the coast of County Antrim had risen for morning prayers, as they had every day for generations, their voices lifting in ancient hymns that had echoed across these waters since the time of St. Patrick himself. But as the sun climbed higher, they saw something that chilled their blood more than any winter storm. Sleek wooden ships with fearsome dragon heads cutting through the waves, their striped sails billowing in the wind like the wings of some terrible bird of prey. These weren't trading vessels or pilgrim ships bringing news from the continent. These were warships filled with men whose very appearance struck terror into Christian hearts. Tall, fair-haired warriors with braided beards and eyes like winter ice. They wore mail shirts that gleamed in the morning light and carried round shields painted with symbols no Irish monk could understand. Their axes and swords weren't tools of honest labour, but instruments of war crafted for one purpose: to kill and plunder with ruthless efficiency. The Vikings who descended upon Rathlin Island that day weren't mindless barbarians, though that's how the terrified monks who survived would remember them. These were skilled seafarers and warriors from the fjords of Norway, driven by a complex mixture of motives that the Christian world couldn't comprehend. Some sought wealth and glory to win fame in the halls of their ancestors. Others were younger sons with no inheritance, seeking land and opportunity in foreign shores. Still others were following their own religious beliefs, convinced that dying in battle would earn them a place in Valhalla alongside the gods themselves. The assault on Rathlin was swift and brutal. The Vikings had studied their target carefully, timing their attack for maximum surprise and minimum resistance. Monasteries were ideal prey for their purposes, wealthy enough to make raids profitable, isolated enough to prevent quick reinforcement, and populated by men who had taken vows of peace and possessed no military training. Within hours, the monastery that had stood for centuries as a beacon of learning and faith was reduced to smoking ruins, its treasures carried off to Viking longships, its monks either dead or hauled away as slaves. But Rathlin was just the beginning. Over the following decades, Viking raids intensified and spread across Ireland like a plague. No coastal monastery was safe from their dragon ships, no island retreat too remote for their reach. Skellig Michael, that impossible monastery perched on a rocky pinnacle off the Kerry coast, watched helplessly as Viking vessels circled below like sharks around wounded prey. The great monasteries of the east, Clonmacnoise, Clonard, Kildare, found themselves under constant threat as the raiders pushed inland along Ireland's rivers, using their shallow draft vessels to penetrate deep into the heart of the country. The psychological impact of these raids was perhaps even more devastating than the physical destruction. For centuries, Irish monasteries had been sanctuaries where the worst enemies would respect the right of sanctuary, where even warring kings would lay down their arms rather than violate holy ground. The Vikings recognized no such conventions. To them, Christian churches were simply repositories of wealth protected by men too weak to defend them. They showed no more reverence for carved stone crosses than they would for any other obstacle in their path. The Irish response to these early raids revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their civilization. Individual kings and their warriors often fought with desperate courage against the invaders, and Irish warbands could be formidable opponents when they caught Vikings away from their ships. But the political fragmentation that had allowed Irish culture to flourish in peaceful times became a fatal weakness when facing organised external threats. While one kingdom battled Viking raiders, neighbouring rulers might see an opportunity to settle old scores or seize territory from their distracted rivals. The Vikings quickly learned to exploit these divisions. They began playing Irish kings against one another, offering their services as mercenaries in local conflicts in exchange for payment and plunder rights. What had begun as simple hit-and-run raids evolved into something far more dangerous: permanent Viking settlements that would serve as bases for further expansion and eventual conquest. The establishment of the first Viking towns in Ireland around 840 AD marked a fundamental shift in both Viking strategy and Irish history. Instead of simply raiding and retreating, the Norsemen began building fortified bases that they called long forts, ship forts designed to protect their vessels while providing secure winter quarters for their warriors. The most important of these would eventually grow into Dublin, a name derived from the Irish Dubh Linn, meaning black pool. Dublin's location wasn't chosen by accident. Situated at the mouth of the River Liffey on the east coast, it provided perfect access to the Irish Sea while serving as a gateway to the interior via Ireland's river system. From Dublin, Viking fleets could strike at targets across the Irish Sea, raid deep into the Irish heartland, or sail south to plunder the coasts of Wales and England. It became the nerve centre of a Viking network that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. The Vikings who settled in Dublin and other long forts weren't just warriors and raiders. They were traders, craftsmen, shipbuilders and colonists who brought with them technologies and connections that would transform Irish society. They introduced new methods of warfare, including superior weapons and armour that Irish smiths would quickly learn to copy and improve. They brought new crops and agricultural techniques from their Scandinavian homeland. Most importantly, they established Ireland's first true urban centres, creating a new form of settlement that would fundamentally alter the country's social and economic structure. The impact of Viking urbanization on Irish society cannot be overstated. For over a millennium, the Irish had lived in a rural society centered on scattered farmsteads and periodic gatherings at royal sites or monastic centers. The concept of a permanent town where people lived in close proximity, engaged in specialized trades, and participated in irregular markets was completely foreign to traditional Irish culture. Yet within a few generations, these Viking towns would become integral to Irish life, serving as centres of commerce, craftwork, and cultural exchange. But the Vikings didn't simply impose their culture on Ireland. They also absorbed and adapted Irish traditions in ways that created something entirely new. Viking settlers learned Irish, married Irish women, and gradually adopted many Irish customs while retaining their own distinctive identity. Their children, known as Gall Gaels or Foreign Gaels, belonged fully to neither culture, but created a unique synthesis that combined the best of both worlds. This cultural blending was particularly evident in the realm of art and craftsmanship. Viking metalworkers learned Irish techniques for working gold and silver, while Irish artists incorporated Scandinavian motifs and styles into their own work. The result was a distinctive Hiberno-Norse artistic tradition that produced some of medieval Europe's most beautiful objects, including elaborate brooches, ornate weapons, and intricate jewellery that combined Celtic spirals with Viking animal designs. The religious dimension of the Viking settlement was equally complex. While the raiders who had terrorized Irish monasteries were pagans who worshipped Odin, Thor, and Freya, many of the settlers gradually converted to Christianity. This conversion was often pragmatic rather than spiritual. Christian Vikings could trade more easily with Irish neighbours and participate more fully in the political life of their adopted homeland. But whatever their motivations, the Christianization of the Vikings removed much of the religious antagonism that had characterized the early raiding period. By the mid-9th century, the Viking presence in Ireland had evolved from a series of raids into a permanent settlement that was reshaping Irish society in fundamental ways. The old certainties of Celtic civilization were giving way to new forms of organization and new possibilities for cultural development. Irish kings were learning to adapt their military tactics to deal with Viking threats, while also exploiting Viking military technology for their own purposes. The great Irish monasteries, those centres of learning that had made Ireland famous across Europe, faced the most severe challenges of their existence. Many had been repeatedly raided and burned, their libraries scattered, their treasures stolen, their communities dispersed. Some monks fled to more secure locations in the interior, or even left Ireland entirely, carrying their manuscripts and knowledge to continental monasteries, where they could continue their scholarly work in safety. Yet Irish monasticism proved remarkably resilient in the face of Viking pressure. New monasteries were established in locations chosen for security rather than convenience. Existing communities rebuilt their churches with round towers, those distinctive tall, narrow structures that served both as bell towers and as refuges during raids. The monks developed new strategies for protecting their most valuable manuscripts and treasures, creating hiding places, and establishing networks of allied communities that could provide sanctuary when needed. The round towers that began appearing across the Irish landscape during the Viking Age became one of the most distinctive features of Irish architecture. These structures, typically 30 metres tall with their entrance several metres above ground level, were marvels of medieval engineering. Built entirely of stone without mortar, they could withstand both Viking axes and the ravages of time. When raiders approached, the monks would climb inside through the elevated doorway, pull up their ladder, and wait out the attack while their bells continued to call the faithful to prayer. But the Vikings brought more than just military challenges to Ireland. They also brought new opportunities for trade and cultural exchange that would ultimately benefit Irish society enormously. The Viking trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Byzantium opened up new markets for Irish goods and brought exotic products to Irish shores. Irish metalworkers found eager buyers for their jewellery and weapons in Scandinavian markets, while Irish merchants gained access to amber from the Baltic, silk from the East, and silver from the Islamic world. The establishment of Viking towns also created new opportunities for Irish people to engage in trade and craftsmanship. Many Irish families moved to these urban centres, learning new skills and adapting to new ways of life. Irish women married Viking settlers, creating family networks that bridged the cultural divide. Irish warriors served in Viking armies, gaining valuable military experience and connections that they could use to advance their own careers. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking challenge forced Irish society to adapt and innovate in ways that ultimately strengthened rather than weakened Irish civilization. Irish kings learned to build better fortifications, develop more effective military strategies, and create more sophisticated political alliances. Irish craftsmen improved their techniques by studying Viking methods and competing with Viking artisans. Irish scholars preserved their traditions more systematically, recognizing that their cultural heritage was under threat and needed to be protected for future generations. The Viking Age in Ireland also witnessed the emergence of new forms of Irish identity and resistance. The shared experience of facing foreign invasion helped forge stronger bonds between previously fractious Irish kingdoms. The defence of Irish monasteries became a rallying cry that united Christian warriors across traditional tribal boundaries. The preservation of Irish language, law, and custom took on new significance as acts of cultural resistance against foreign domination. By 900 AD, Ireland had been transformed by 2 centuries of Viking contact. The island that had once been a peaceful backwater, known primarily for its monasteries and scholars, had become a contested frontier where different cultures clashed and blended in complex ways. Viking Dublin had grown into one of Europe's major trading centres, its merchants and craftsmen competing with those of London, York, and Hamburg. Irish kings had learned to use Viking military techniques and even Viking mercenaries to prosecute their own wars more effectively. Yet beneath all these changes, the fundamental character of Irish civilization remained intact. The Irish language continued to evolve and flourish. Irish law and social customs adapted to new circumstances, but retained their essential characteristics. Irish artistic traditions incorporated new influences while maintaining their distinctive Celtic identity. Most importantly, the Irish never lost their sense of themselves as a unique people with their own destiny to fulfill. The stage was now set for the next great chapter in Irish history. The Vikings had established themselves as permanent residents rather than temporary raiders, creating new centres of power that would compete with traditional Irish kingdoms. Irish society had adapted to meet the Viking challenge, but had also been fundamentally altered by the encounter. New forms of warfare, new patterns of trade, new styles of art, and new concepts of urban life had all been introduced to Ireland through Viking contact. But the most dramatic developments were still to come. The 10th and 11th centuries would witness the rise of great Irish kings who would unite large portions of the island under their rule, challenging both Viking settlers and rival Irish dynasties. The most famous of these would be Brian Boru, whose victory at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 would mark the end of the Viking Age and the beginning of a new era in Irish history. The Ireland that would emerge from the Viking centuries was neither purely Celtic nor purely Norse, but something entirely new, a hybrid civilization that combined the best elements of both traditions while maintaining its own unique identity. This new Ireland would face fresh challenges in the centuries to come, but it would meet them with the confidence and resilience that had been forged in the furnace of the Viking Age. The dawn of the 10th century found Ireland poised on the edge of transformation once again. The Viking settlements that had begun as military outposts were evolving into thriving commercial centres, while Irish kingdoms were consolidating power and learning to harness the very forces that had once threatened to destroy them. From this crucible of conflict and adaptation would emerge one of the most remarkable figures in Irish history, a man whose name would echo through the centuries as the embodiment of Irish resistance and pride. Brian Boru wasn't born to greatness. He entered the world around 940 AD as Brian MacSennetig, the younger son of a minor king in the remote kingdom of Dal Gcais in what is now County Clare. In the rigid hierarchy of Irish royal succession, Brian had little prospect of inheriting his father's throne, much less of uniting all Ireland under his rule. Yet circumstances would conspire to thrust this unlikely hero onto the stage of history at precisely the moment when Ireland needed a leader who could bridge the gap between the old Celtic world and the new realities of Viking Age politics. The Ireland of Brian's youth was a patchwork of competing powers locked in an intricate dance of alliance and betrayal. The great Viking stronghold of Dublin dominated the eastern seaboard, its Norse rulers wielding influence far beyond their city walls through a combination of military might, commercial connections, and shrewd political manoeuvring. In the north, the Uí Néill dynasty maintained their ancient claim to the high kingship from their seat at Tara, though their actual authority had been steadily eroded by centuries of political fragmentation. The Western kingdoms remained largely Irish in character, but they were increasingly isolated from the dynamic changes transforming the rest of the island. Into this complex political landscape stepped the young Brian, driven by ambitions that would have seemed absurd to anyone who knew his humble origins. When his older brother Mathgamane inherited the Dal Gcais throne, Brian served as his loyal supporter and military commander, gaining valuable experience in the brutal warfare that characterized 10th century Ireland. But when Mathgamane was betrayed and murdered by rivals in 976, Brian found himself thrust into leadership of a kingdom that was small, remote, and surrounded by enemies. What happened next defied every expectation of medieval Irish politics. Instead of accepting his kingdom's marginal status or seeking safety through submission to more powerful neighbours, Brian embarked on a campaign of conquest that would reshape the balance of power across Ireland. His strategy was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He would use the very tactics and technologies that the Vikings had introduced to Ireland against both Viking settlers and Irish rivals who stood in his path. Brian's first target was the powerful kingdom of Munster, the southwestern province that had been dominated for centuries by the Eoghanach dynasty. These ancient kings traced their lineage back to the legendary Eogan Mór and had ruled from their stronghold at Cashel for over 500 years. They commanded vast resources, controlled important trade routes, and enjoyed the loyalty of numerous client kingdoms throughout the region. By any rational calculation, Brian's small tribal army should have been crushed within weeks of challenging such established power. But Brian possessed advantages that his enemies failed to recognize until it was too late. His warriors were battle-hardened veterans who had learned to fight both Vikings and Irish opponents with equal skill. His kingdom's location on the Shannon estuary gave him control of Ireland's most important inland waterway, allowing him to move troops and supplies with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Most importantly, Brian himself was emerging as a military genius whose innovative tactics would revolutionize Irish warfare. The campaign for Munster unfolded like a masterclass in medieval military strategy. Brian didn't attempt to meet his enemies in the kind of formal pitched battles that Irish kings traditionally preferred. Instead, he employed a combination of swift raids, strategic alliances, and psychological warfare that kept his opponents constantly off balance. He would strike at their strongholds when they least expected it, disappear into the countryside before reinforcements could arrive, then emerge elsewhere to attack their allies or disrupt their supply lines. Brian's use of naval power was particularly innovative for an Irish king. While his enemies remained wedded to land-based warfare, Brian constructed a fleet of ships that allowed him to project power along Ireland's rivers and coasts with devastating effect. He could appear suddenly at settlements that considered themselves safe from attack, load his vessels with plunder and captives, then vanish downstream before defenders could organize effective resistance. This maritime dimension to his campaigns gave him a crucial advantage over rivals who couldn't match his mobility or predict his next move. The psychological impact of Brian's victories was perhaps even more important than their immediate military consequences. For generations, Irish kings had accepted the political status quo that divided the island into numerous small kingdoms, locked in endless cycles of petty warfare. Brian's rapid conquests demonstrated that this ancient system was vulnerable to a leader with sufficient vision, skill, and determination to challenge it. Young warriors flocked to his banner, attracted by the prospect of sharing in his glory and plunder. Traditional allies began reconsidering their loyalties as Brian's power grew and his enemy's weakness became apparent. By 978, just 2 years after inheriting his small tribal kingdom, Brian had made himself king of Munster, displacing a dynasty that had ruled the province for half a millennium. But this was only the beginning of his extraordinary rise to power. Having demonstrated that even the most established Irish kingdoms could be overthrown by superior strategy and determination, Brian turned his attention to the ultimate prize, dominance over the Viking kingdom of Dublin and the high kingship of all Ireland. The Dublin Vikings presented a very different challenge from the Irish kingdoms Brian had already conquered. These weren't simply warriors defending their ancestral lands. They were sophisticated political operators who had survived and thrived in Ireland for nearly 2 centuries through a combination of military prowess, commercial acumen, and diplomatic flexibility. The Viking kings of Dublin maintained extensive international connections that could potentially bring foreign reinforcements to their aid. Their city was strongly fortified and well supplied, capable of withstanding extended sieges. Most importantly, they had learned to exploit Irish political divisions with masterful skill, playing rival kingdoms against each other while strengthening their own position. The reigning king of Dublin during Brian's rise was Sigtryg Silkbeard, a ruler whose very name reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized Viking Ireland by the late 10th century. Sigtryg was as much Irish as Norse in his outlook and methods, equally comfortable negotiating with Celtic chieftains or Scandinavian sea kings. He had converted to Christianity, married into Irish royal families, and surrounded himself with advisors who understood both Viking and Irish political traditions. Under his leadership, Dublin had become not just a Viking stronghold, but a truly international city that served as a bridge between Ireland and the wider medieval world. The conflict between Brian and Sigtryg would span decades and involve some of the most complex political manoeuvring in Irish history. Both men understood that their struggle was about more than just territorial control. It was a contest to determine what kind of society Ireland would become in the new millennium. Would the island be dominated by a traditional Irish high king ruling through ancient Celtic customs and institutions, or would it be shaped by the more cosmopolitan, commercially oriented culture that had emerged from the fusion of Viking and Irish elements? The campaign for Dublin began not with armies and battles, but with a patient effort to isolate the Viking kingdom from its Irish allies. Brian understood that he couldn't simply besiege Dublin and wait for its defenders to surrender. The city's commercial wealth and international connections made it capable of sustaining resistance indefinitely. Instead, he needed to demonstrate to potential Irish allies that supporting Dublin was no longer a viable political strategy. This required a series of calculated military and diplomatic moves designed to showcase his own power while undermining confidence in Viking strength. Brian's strategy unfolded over more than a decade of careful preparation and occasional sharp conflicts. He systematically conquered or neutralized the Irish kingdoms that had traditionally served as Dublin's allies, offering generous terms to those who submitted willingly while crushing those who resisted. He disrupted the trade routes that supplied Dublin with essential goods, forcing the Vikings to rely on increasingly expensive and unreliable overseas connections. Most cleverly, He began offering his own protection and patronage to Irish merchants and craftsmen who had previously depended on Dublin's markets, gradually weakening the economic foundations of Viking power. The decisive confrontation finally came in 999, when Brian's forces met a coalition of Dublin Vikings and their remaining Irish allies at the Battle of Glenmama in County Wicklow. The engagement was a crushing victory for Brian's army, effectively ending organised resistance to his conquest of Eastern Ireland. Sigtrygg's Silkbeard was forced to submit to Brian's authority, though he was allowed to retain his throne in Dublin as a client king under Brian's overlordship. With Dublin under his control and Munster firmly in his grasp, Brian turned his attention to the northern half of Ireland, where the ancient Uí Néill dynasty still maintained their claim to the high kingship. This would prove to be his most difficult challenge yet, not because the northern kings were militarily stronger than his previous opponents, but because they possessed something that couldn't be conquered through force of arms: legitimacy rooted in centuries of tradition and religious sanction. The Uí Néill High Kings ruled from Tara, that ancient sacred site where Irish kings had been inaugurated since time immemorial. Their authority was recognised not just by their own warriors, but by the Druids who had become Christian priests, the Brehons who interpreted Irish law, and the Fili whose poetry could make or break royal reputations. To challenge the Uí Néill wasn't simply to pick a fight with another dynasty. It was to question the entire traditional basis of Irish political authority. Brian's solution to this dilemma was characteristically innovative and audacious. Instead of simply attempting to defeat the northern kings in battle, he launched a comprehensive campaign to demonstrate that he was not just a successful warlord, but the legitimate heir to Ireland's ancient traditions of kingship. He commissioned genealogies that traced his lineage back to the legendary kings of prehistory. He patronised poets and scholars who celebrated his achievements in traditional Irish verse forms. He made conspicuous donations to monasteries and churches, demonstrating his piety and earning the support of influential clergy. Most importantly, Brian began styling himself as Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish, a title that claimed authority not just over his conquered territories, but over all the Irish people, wherever they might be found. This was an unprecedented assertion of power that went far beyond the traditional concept of high kingship, where previous Irish rulers had been content to exact tribute and acknowledgement of superiority from subordinate kings. Brian was claiming the right to rule directly over all Ireland as a unified kingdom. The northern campaign that began around 1000 AD was unlike anything Brian had attempted before. The Uí Néill kingdoms were not only militarily formidable, but also deeply entrenched in their home territories, with networks of allies and fortifications that had been developed over many generations. The terrain of Northern Ireland favoured defenders, with its forests, bogs, and rivers providing natural obstacles to invasion. Most challenging of all, Brian was fighting not just against armies, but against a way of life that many Irish people considered sacred and immutable. The conflict unfolded slowly, with Brian making gradual progress through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic patience. He understood that conquering the north would require more than battlefield victories. It would demand a fundamental shift in how the Irish people understood their own identity and political organisation. This was a cultural revolution disguised as a military campaign, and its success would determine whether Ireland could unite under a single ruler or remain forever divided into competing factions. By 1002, Brian's patient strategy had achieved its ultimate goal. The last Uí Néill High King, Mael Secnail MacDomnail, formally submitted to Brian's authority at a ceremony that symbolically transferred the high kingship from its ancient northern seat to this upstart ruler from the western margins of the island. For the first time since the legendary Niall of the Nine Hostages, Ireland was united under the rule of a single king, whose authority extended from the northern coast to the southern shores. Brian Boru had achieved something that no Irish ruler before him had managed: the creation of a genuinely unified Irish kingdom that commanded the loyalty of both Gaelic chieftains and Viking settlers. His court at Kincora on the Shannon became a centre of learning and culture that rivaled the great royal centres of medieval Europe. Scholars and artists flocked to his patronage, creating works that celebrated both his military achievements and his role as a patron of Irish tradition. But Brian's greatest triumph would also sow the seeds of future conflict. His success in uniting Ireland had been achieved through a combination of military conquest and political innovation that challenged many traditional assumptions about Irish society and government. Not everyone was comfortable with the changes he had wrought, and some began to question whether this new unified kingdom could survive the death of the extraordinary man who had created it. The answer to that question would come sooner than anyone expected, in a battle that would become the most famous single engagement in Irish history and mark the end of the Viking Age in Ireland forever. The morning of Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, dawned grey and ominous over the plains north of Dublin, where two great armies prepared for what would become the most decisive battle in Irish history. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension as warriors from across the known world gathered for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Ireland, but the future of Viking power in the British Isles. Brian Boru, now in his 70s, was too old to lead the charge himself. But his presence on the battlefield was a source of immense inspiration to his forces. The High King of Ireland had spent the previous evening in prayer, knowing that this battle would either cement his legacy as the unifier of Ireland or see his great work crumble into dust. Around him gathered the flower of Irish nobility, kings and princes from Munster, Connaught, and Meath, who had sworn allegiance to his cause and now prepared to stake their lives on his vision of a united Ireland. Facing them across the field of Clontarf was an equally formidable coalition, but one driven by very different motivations. Sigtryg Silkbeard had spent months assembling this army, calling upon every favour, every alliance, every connection he had built during his years as King of Dublin. Viking warriors had sailed from the Orkney Islands, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man to answer his call. Norse adventurers from as far away as Iceland had joined the expedition, drawn by promises of plunder and the chance to participate in what many believed would be the final great Viking victory in Ireland. But this wasn't simply a battle between Irish and Viking forces. The complexity of 11th century Irish politics ensured that both sides included warriors from both cultures. Fighting alongside Sigtryg were several Irish kings who had refused to accept Brian's authority, men who preferred the old system of divided kingdoms to Brian's revolutionary concept of unified rule. Similarly, Brian's army included Viking settlers who had thrown in their lot with the Irish High King, recognising that their future prosperity depended on adapting to the new political reality he represented. The battle lines that formed at Clontarf reflected the sophisticated military evolution that had taken place during the Viking Age. Gone were the days when Irish warriors charged into battle with nothing but courage and bronze weapons. Brian's army was equipped with the finest steel weapons that Irish smiths could forge, armour that combined Celtic craftsmanship with Viking practicality, and tactical formations that had been tested in dozens of previous campaigns. These weren't the disorganised Celtic warbands that had first encountered Viking raiders 2 centuries earlier. They were disciplined soldiers who understood both individual combat and coordinated group tactics. The Viking coalition was equally impressive in its military sophistication. These weren't desperate raiders seeking quick plunder, but experienced warriors who had fought in battles across Europe and beyond. Many had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, learning military techniques from the Byzantine Empire. Others had participated in the great Viking expeditions to England, France, and even North America. They brought with them not just superior weapons and armour, but knowledge of siege warfare, naval tactics, and strategic planning that had been refined through generations of conflict. As the two armies faced each other across the field, both sides understood that this battle would be different from the countless skirmishes and raids that had characterized the Viking Age in Ireland. This wasn't about cattle rustling or monastery plundering or even territorial conquest in the traditional sense. This was about the fundamental question of what Ireland would become: a unified kingdom under native rule, or a collection of competing powers dominated by foreign influence. The battle began at sunrise, with the traditional exchange of challenges and insults that had preceded Irish combat since ancient times. Warriors on both sides recited their genealogies, proclaimed their past victories, and called upon their gods to witness their courage. But beneath these ancient rituals lay modern military planning that would have impressed generals in any contemporary European army. Brian had positioned his forces with careful attention to the terrain and the enemy's likely tactics. His right flank was anchored on Dublin Bay, preventing the Vikings from using their superior naval mobility to outflank his position. His left stretched inland toward the forests, where Irish warriors could use their knowledge of the local terrain to maximum advantage. In the centre, he placed his most experienced troops under the command of his son Murshad, a proven warrior who had inherited his father's tactical genius along with his ambition. The Viking battle plan was equally sophisticated, designed to exploit what Sigtryg believed were weaknesses in Brian's coalition. The Dublin king knew that many of Brian's allies were recent converts to his cause, men who might waver if the battle turned against them. His strategy was to concentrate overwhelming force against Brian's centre, hoping to break through the Irish line and create panic that would spread to the less committed elements of Brian's army. When the battle finally commenced, it did so with a violence and intensity that shocked even veterans of the Viking Wars. The initial clash between the two shield walls was so fierce that the sound could be heard miles away, a thunderous din of steel on steel, wood on wood, and the cries of wounded Anasted of their prowess in dozens dying men. Warriors who had bow of previous battles found themselves facing opponents whose skill and determination matched or exceeded their own. The fighting that followed was unlike anything previously seen in Irish warfare. This wasn't the heroic single combat celebrated in ancient poetry, nor was it the hit-and-run raiding that had characterized the early Viking period. This was sustained, organized, brutal warfare conducted by armies that understood the importance of maintaining formation, supporting their comrades, and following tactical plans even in the chaos of battle. For hours, the two battle lines surged back and forth across the field, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Individual acts of heroism were swallowed up in the larger struggle, as warriors who might have become legendary heroes in earlier ages died anonymously in the press of battle. The very sophistication of the military forces involved meant that victory would go not to the most courageous individuals, but to the army that could maintain its organization and morale longest under extreme pressure. As the day wore on, several factors began to tip the balance in favour of Brian's forces. The Irish warriors were fighting on their home ground, familiar with every hill and stream that might provide tactical advantage. More importantly, they were fighting for a cause that transcended mere personal ambition or desire for plunder. These men believed they were defending not just their king, but their entire way of life against foreign domination. The Viking coalition, for all its military skill, began to show signs of strain as the battle progressed. The various contingents had different fighting styles, different languages, and different motivations for being there. What had seemed like strength in diversity during the planning stages became a weakness when rapid coordination was needed under combat conditions. Messages couldn't be passed quickly between units that spoke different languages, and tactical adjustments that worked for Norwegian Vikings might not suit warriors from the Irish Sea Islands. The turning point came when Murshad, Brian's son, led a devastating charge that broke through the Viking centre and threatened to roll up their entire battle line. This wasn't the random heroics of individual warriors, but a carefully coordinated assault that exploited a momentary gap in the enemy formation. The Irish warriors who followed Murshad knew exactly what they were supposed to do, having drilled these tactics repeatedly during their preparation for this campaign. The breakthrough created panic in the Viking ranks that spread faster than their commanders could contain it. Warriors who had stood firm for hours suddenly found themselves isolated from their comrades, facing Irish opponents who seemed to appear from all directions. The disciplined retreat that might have salvaged something from defeat degenerated into a rout as different Viking contingents began fleeing toward their ships without coordinating with their allies. But victory came at a terrible cost for Brian's forces as well. Murshad, the heir to Brian's throne and the architect of the decisive breakthrough, was killed in the moment of triumph, struck down by a Viking warrior's axe, just as success seemed assured. Around him fell many of the finest warriors of Munster and Connaught, men whose deaths would leave gaps in Irish leadership that would take decades to fill. The most shocking casualty of all was Brian Boru himself. The aged High King, who had remained in his tent during the battle due to his advanced years, was discovered and killed by fleeing Viking warriors who stumbled upon his position during their retreat. The man who had spent decades building a unified Irish kingdom died just as his greatest victory was being achieved, struck down not in heroic combat, but in the confused aftermath of battle. The death of Brian Boru cast a shadow over what should have been the greatest triumph in Irish history. His army had won a crushing victory that effectively ended Viking military power in Ireland forever. Sigtrygg's Silkbeard's coalition was destroyed, with many of its leaders dead, and the survivors scattered to distant shores. Never again would Viking raiders descend upon Irish monasteries with impunity. And never again would Dublin serve as the base for foreign attempts to dominate the island. Yet the victory felt hollow to the Irish warriors who surveyed the carnage at Clontarf. They had won the battle, but lost the leader whose vision had made victory possible. Without Brian's unifying presence, would his kingdom survive? Could his successors maintain the delicate balance of alliances and accommodations that had held his coalition together? The questions that haunted the battlefield that evening would shape Irish politics for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of Clontarf revealed both the completeness of the Irish victory and the fragility of Brian's political achievement. The surviving Viking leaders who had participated in the battle fled Ireland, never to return as conquerors. Sigtryg Silkbeard maintained his throne in Dublin, but only as a client king whose power was strictly limited to the city and its immediate surroundings. The age of Viking expansion in Ireland was definitively over, replaced by a new era in which Norse settlers would survive only by completely integrating into Irish society. But the death of Brian and his son Murchad created a succession crisis that threatened to undo everything the High King had accomplished. The complex system of alliances and obligations that had held his kingdom together was personal to Brian himself. Without his charismatic leadership and proven military success, many of his subordinate kings began to reconsider their loyalty to the central authority. Within months of Clontarf, the unified Irish kingdom that Brian had spent decades creating began to fragment back into competing regional powers. The irony was bitter and profound. Brian Boru had succeeded in ending the Viking threat to Irish independence, but his very success had come at the cost of the political unity that might have allowed Ireland to resist future foreign invasions. The victory at Clontarf had proven that the Irish could defeat any external enemy when they fought together under effective leadership. But it had also demonstrated how dependent that unity was on individual genius rather than institutional strength. The Ireland that emerged from the Viking Age was fundamentally different from the Celtic society that had existed before the first longships appeared on the horizon. 2.5 centuries of conflict and cultural exchange had created a hybrid civilization that combined the best elements of both Irish and Scandinavian traditions. Viking towns had become Irish cities, Norse settlers had become Irish citizens, and foreign military techniques had been absorbed into native tactical systems. The Irish language had been enriched with hundreds of Norse loanwords that reflected new technologies, new concepts, and new ways of organizing society. Irish art had incorporated Scandinavian motifs and techniques, creating distinctive styles that would influence European culture for centuries. Irish law had adapted to deal with commercial relationships and urban life in ways that would have been unimaginable in the purely rural society of earlier centuries. Most importantly, the Viking challenge had forced Irish society to develop new forms of political organization and military capability that made it far more formidable than it had ever been before. The kings who emerged from the Viking Wars were not the cattle-rustling chieftains of earlier eras, but sophisticated rulers who understood international politics, commanded professional armies, and governed complex administrative systems. Yet these advances came with costs that would become apparent only in the centuries that followed. The political fragmentation that had characterized pre-Viking Ireland had never been fully overcome, despite Brian's remarkable achievements. The death of strong leaders continued to trigger succession crises that weakened central authority and invited external intervention. Most ominously, Ireland's success in defeating the Vikings had attracted the attention of other foreign powers, who were beginning to look across the Irish Sea with acquisitive eyes. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 had created a new and far more dangerous threat to Irish independence than the Vikings had ever posed. Where the Norse had been raiders and settlers seeking individual opportunities, the Normans were systematic conquerors who built institutional structures designed to maintain permanent control over subjugated populations. Their success in subduing England demonstrated that they possessed military and organizational capabilities that surpassed anything the Irish had previously encountered. As the 12th century dawned, Ireland faced a new challenge that would test everything the island had learned during the Viking centuries. The hard-won lessons of Clontarf about the importance of unity, effective leadership, and military innovation would soon be put to their ultimate test against an enemy that combined Norman efficiency with papal blessing in a lethal mixture that threatened the very existence of Irish civilization. The stage was set for the most consequential invasion in Irish history, one that would succeed where the Vikings had failed and establish foreign domination over Ireland that would last for centuries. How the Irish would respond to this new threat, and whether the political and military developments of the Viking Age would prove sufficient to preserve their independence, would determine the fate of Ireland for generations to come. The victory at Clontarf had ended one chapter in Irish history, but it had also opened another that would prove even more challenging and transformative than anything that had come before. The island that had emerged victorious from its struggle with the Vikings was about to face its greatest test yet. The decades following Clontarf witnessed Ireland's gradual transformation from a collection of warring kingdoms into something resembling a coherent political entity, yet the dream of lasting unity remained tantalizingly out of reach. The sons and grandsons of Brian Boru struggled to maintain the delicate balance their ancestor had achieved, but without his charismatic authority and proven military genius. The centrifugal forces of Irish politics began reasserting themselves with devastating consequences. The succession crisis that erupted immediately after Brian's death revealed the fundamental weakness in the Irish political system that no amount of military success could overcome. Unlike the emerging feudal monarchies of continental Europe, where primogeniture and institutional structures provided clear mechanisms for transferring power, Irish kingship remained personal and charismatic, dependent on individual prowess rather than hereditary right or administrative competence. Brian's surviving sons and nephews each had legitimate claims to portions of his inheritance, but none possessed the combination of military skill, political acumen, and sheer force of personality that had allowed their predecessor to unite such diverse and traditionally hostile elements under a single banner. Donchad, Brian's eldest surviving son, inherited the core kingdom of Munster, but his attempts to assert authority over his father's former allies met with resistance that quickly escalated into open warfare. The fragmentation that followed was swift and brutal. Within 5 years of Clontarf, Ireland had reverted to its traditional pattern of competing regional kingdoms, each jealously guarding its independence and viewing its neighbours with suspicion. The Wee Nail dynasties of the north, who had submitted to Brian only under extreme duress, were among the first to reassert their ancient claims to supremacy. The kings of Leinster and Connaught, freed from the necessity of acknowledging any superior authority, resumed their endless cycles of cattle raids and territorial disputes. Yet the Ireland that emerged from this political collapse was not simply a return to the pre-Brian status quo. 2 centuries of Viking contact and conflict had fundamentally altered Irish society in ways that could not be undone by political fragmentation. The great trading towns that had begun as Viking longforts continued to flourish under Irish rule, serving as centres of commerce and craftsmanship that connected Ireland to the wider European economy. Dublin, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick had become integral parts of the Irish landscape, their mixed populations of Norse settlers and Irish immigrants, creating a unique urban culture that blended elements from both traditions. The military innovations that had enabled Brian's conquests also persisted. Even as the political unity he had created crumbled, Irish kings continued to employ the sophisticated tactical formations and siege techniques that had proven so effective against Viking forces. They maintained professional armies equipped with the finest weapons and armour that Irish smiths could produce, drawing on metallurgical knowledge that combined Celtic traditions with Norse expertise. Most importantly, they had learned the crucial importance of naval power, building fleets that could project force along Ireland's rivers and coasts with unprecedented effectiveness. These military advances proved essential as Ireland entered a new phase of internal conflict that was far more destructive than the Viking Wars had ever been. The competing kings who emerged after Brian's death weren't content with the limited territorial ambitions that had characterized pre-Viking warfare. They had been inspired by Brian's example to dream of Ireland-wide dominance, but they lacked his strategic patience and diplomatic skill. The result was a series of wars that were both more frequent and more devastating than anything Ireland had previously experienced. The struggle for supremacy that dominated 12th century Irish politics was complicated by the emergence of new power centres that challenged the traditional regional divisions. The Kingdom of Dublin, under its Norse-Irish rulers, had evolved into a significant force that could tip the balance between competing Irish dynasties. The great monasteries, enriched by centuries of royal patronage and international connections, wielded influence that transcended political boundaries. Most significantly, a new generation of Irish kings had learned to think beyond their ancestral territories, seeking to build kingdoms that crossed traditional tribal and provincial lines. Among these ambitious rulers, none was more successful or more controversial than Ruaidhrí wa Conchobar, King of Connaught, who would become the last native ruler to hold the title of High King of Ireland. Ruaidhrí had inherited a kingdom that was relatively poor and politically marginal, but he possessed the vision and determination to transform it into the dominant power in 12th century Ireland. His methods were ruthless and his ambitions unlimited, but his achievements would briefly restore something resembling Brian Boru's unified kingdom. Ruaidhrí's rise to power began in the 1140s, when he succeeded his father as King of Connaught, and immediately embarked on a campaign of expansion that would continue for 3 decades. Unlike Brian, who had built his power gradually through careful alliances and strategic patience, Ruaidhrí relied primarily on military force and political intimidation to achieve his goals. He possessed an intuitive understanding of the new realities of Irish warfare, employing combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and naval forces in ways that consistently surprised and overwhelmed his opponents. The Connaught army that Ruaidhrí assembled was unlike anything seen in Ireland since Brian's time. These weren't the traditional war bands of Celtic literature composed of individual warriors fighting for personal glory and plunder. They were disciplined soldiers, organized into specialized units, equipped with standardized weapons and armor, and trained to execute complex tactical maneuvers under battlefield conditions. Rhuaidry had studied the military methods that had made the Norman conquest of England so successful, adapting their techniques to Irish conditions while avoiding their weaknesses. Most innovatively, Rhuaidry created what was essentially Ireland's first professional navy, building a fleet of warships that could challenge any force on Ireland's rivers or coastal waters. These vessels weren't simply enlarged fishing boats or converted merchant ships, but purpose-built warships designed for speed, maneuverability, and fighting effectiveness. They allowed Rhuaidry to project power across vast distances with unprecedented speed, appearing suddenly at strategic locations before his enemies could organize effective resistance. The systematic conquest of Ireland that Rhuaidry began in the 1150s proceeded with methodical efficiency that recalled Brian Boru's campaigns, but exceeded them in scope and ambition. His first major success came against the Kingdom of Dublin, where he exploited a succession dispute to install his own candidate as king, while maintaining effective control over the city's resources. This gave him access to Dublin's commercial wealth and international connections, providing the financial resources necessary to sustain extended military campaigns. From Dublin, Rhuaidry turned his attention to the southern kingdoms, launching a series of campaigns that systematically reduced Munster to client status. The descendants of Brian Boru, weakened by generations of internecine conflict, proved unable to mount effective resistance against Rhuaidry's modern military methods. One by one, the great fortresses of Munster fell to his armies, their kings either submitting to his authority or fleeing into exile. The conquest of Leinster proved more challenging, not because its kings were militarily stronger than their Munster counterparts, but because they had learned to exploit the complex web of alliances and obligations that characterized Irish politics. The most formidable of these was Diarmait Mac Muircheartaigh, King of Leinster, a ruler whose ambition and ruthlessness matched Rhuaidry's own, but who lacked the resources necessary to challenge Connaught power directly. The conflict between Rhuaidry and Diarmait would have consequences that neither man could have anticipated, setting in motion a chain of events that would bring foreign invasion to Ireland and end forever the independence that had survived Viking conquest. Their personal rivalry, rooted in competing claims to supremacy and complicated by disputes over marriage alliances and territorial boundaries, would ultimately provide the pretext for the most catastrophic foreign intervention in Irish history. The immediate cause of their final confrontation was typically Irish in its complexity and personal nature. Diarmait had abducted Deir Forgail, the wife of Teiganan Ua Rhuic, King of Breifne, and one of Rhuaidry's most important allies. Whether this was genuine abduction or elopement would be debated for centuries, but its political implications were immediately clear. Teiganan demanded justice and revenge, while Diarmait claimed he had acted within his rights according to ancient Irish law and custom. Rhuaidry saw this incident as the perfect opportunity to eliminate his most dangerous rival, while demonstrating his authority as High King to settle disputes between subordinate rulers. In 1166, he assembled the largest army Ireland had seen since Clontarf, drawing contingents from every kingdom that acknowledged his supremacy. The force that marched into Leinster represented the military might of a united Ireland, equipped with the finest weapons and employing the most advanced tactics that Irish military science had developed. The campaign that followed was swift and decisive. Diarmait's forces, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were scattered in a series of engagements that demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of Rhuaidry's military organisation. Within months, the King of Leinster found himself a fugitive in his own kingdom, his strongholds occupied by Connaught garrisons, his allies either dead or fled. His dreams of challenging Rhuaidry's supremacy reduced to ashes, but instead of accepting defeat with the stoic resignation that Irish political tradition demanded, Diarmait MacMachada made a decision that would change the course of Irish history forever. Rather than submit to Ruaidhrí's authority or accept exile in some remote monastery, he chose to seek foreign aid to recover his lost kingdom. In the summer of 1166, he took ship from Ireland and sailed across the Irish Sea to the court of Henry II, King of England, carrying with him a proposition that would prove irresistible to Norman ambition. The Henry II that Diarmait encountered was no ordinary medieval monarch, but rather one of the most powerful and ambitious rulers of his age. The Angevin Empire that Henry had assembled through inheritance, marriage, and conquest stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making him master of territories far larger than those controlled by the King of France. Yet for all his success on the continent, Henry had been frustrated in his attempts to extend his authority over the Celtic lands that bordered his domains. Wales had proven surprisingly resistant to Norman conquest, its mountainous terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics neutralizing many of the advantages that had made the Normans so successful elsewhere. Scotland remained stubbornly independent under its own line of kings, allied to France and hostile to English expansion. Ireland, the largest and richest of the Celtic lands, had remained completely outside Norman influence, its political fragmentation actually serving as a barrier to systematic conquest. Diarmait's arrival at Henry's court therefore represented an unprecedented opportunity to extend Norman power into Ireland through legal means rather than outright conquest. As a dispossessed king seeking to recover his rightful inheritance, Diarmait could provide the legitimacy that Norman lawyers and churchmen required to justify intervention in Irish affairs. His intimate knowledge of Irish political divisions and military weaknesses would be invaluable in planning any expedition to Ireland. Most importantly, Diarmait's proposal offered Henry the chance to accomplish Irish conquest without committing royal resources or risking royal prestige. Instead of mounting an official invasion that might fail and damage his reputation, Henry could authorize private adventurers to assist Diarmait while maintaining plausible deniability about their actions. If they succeeded, he would claim credit for their achievements. If they failed, he could disavow their activities and suffer no political consequences. The agreement that Henry and Diarmait reached in 1167 was masterfully crafted to serve both men's interests while minimizing their risks. Henry would issue letters patent authorizing any of his subjects who chose to do so to assist Diarmait in recovering his kingdom. In return, Diarmait would acknowledge Henry as his overlord and agree to hold Leinster as a fief of the English crown. The arrangement was presented as a simple matter of feudal law, a powerful king assisting a dispossessed vassal to recover his rightful inheritance. But beneath this legal facade lay implications that would transform Ireland forever. The Norman adventurers who would answer Diarmait's call weren't simply mercenaries seeking temporary employment. They were colonists looking for permanent opportunities to establish themselves in new lands. They brought with them not just superior military technology, but also administrative systems, legal concepts, and social structures that were fundamentally alien to Irish tradition. The men who would lead this invasion were products of the Norman frontier, battle-hardened veterans of the Welsh Wars who understood both the opportunities and challenges of conquering Celtic societies. They had learned from experience that military victory was only the first step in successful colonization. Lasting success required the establishment of institutional structures that could maintain Norman authority even after the original conquerors had died. Among these adventurers, none was more formidable than Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known to history as Strongbow, a powerful marcher lord whose Welsh territories had made him wealthy and militarily experienced. Strongbow possessed the resources and ambition necessary to mount a major expedition to Ireland. His agreement to marry Diarmait's daughter Aoife and inherit the kingdom of Leinster transformed what might have been a limited intervention into a full-scale conquest attempt. The preparations for invasion proceeded throughout 1168 and early 1169 with methodical efficiency that reflected Norman organizational capabilities. Strongbow and his associates assembled not just armies, but entire colonial expeditions, complete with administrators, craftsmen, settlers and clergy who would establish Norman institutions in conquered Irish territories. They studied Irish political divisions, identified potential allies and enemies, and developed strategies that would exploit Irish weaknesses while neutralizing Irish strengths. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Rhédri Ua Conchobar remained largely unaware of the storm that was gathering across the Irish Sea. Secure in his position as High King and confident in the military superiority that had enabled his conquests, he saw Diarmait's exile as the final resolution of their rivalry. The possibility that a defeated Irish king might return with foreign support seemed so unlikely as to be hardly worth considering. This complacency would prove to be one of the most fatal mistakes in Irish history. When the first Norman ships appeared off the coast of Wexford in May 1169, they found an island that was politically fragmented, militarily unprepared, and psychologically vulnerable to the kind of systematic conquest that the Normans had perfected through 2 centuries of expansion across Europe. The Ireland that had emerged victorious from its struggle with the Vikings was about to face its greatest challenge yet, one that would test everything the island had learned about unity, resistance, and survival. The small force that landed at Bannow Bay in County Wexford would grow into an invasion that would succeed where the Vikings had failed, establishing foreign domination over Ireland that would endure for centuries and fundamentally alter the character of Irish civilization. The stage was set for the most consequential events in Irish history, a confrontation between 2 very different worlds that would determine whether Ireland would remain an independent Celtic nation or become another conquest of Norman imperialism. The lessons of Clontarf about the importance of unity and effective leadership would soon be put to their ultimate test against an enemy that combined military superiority with institutional sophistication in ways that posed unprecedented threats to Irish independence. As the Norman ships approached the Irish coast, they carried with them not just weapons and warriors, but an entirely different way of organizing society, one that would challenge every assumption about law, government, and social relations that the Irish had developed over centuries of independence. How Ireland would respond to this challenge, and whether the political and military innovations of the post-Viking era would prove sufficient to preserve Irish freedom, would shape the destiny of the island for generations to come. The first Norman landing at Bannow Bay on May Day 1169 was deceptively modest in scale, comprising perhaps 90 knights, 300 archers, and a handful of men-at-arms who waded ashore from 3 small vessels that had crossed the Irish Sea under cover of darkness. To casual observers, this might have seemed like just another raiding party of the type that had troubled Irish coasts for generations. But these weren't raiders seeking quick plunder before disappearing back across the water. They were the advance guard of a conquest that would employ methods and technologies that Ireland had never encountered. The leader of this initial expedition was Robert Fitzstephen, a Welsh Norman lord whose mixed ancestry perfectly embodied the cultural synthesis that characterized the Anglo-Norman frontier. Half Welsh through his mother and Norman through his father, Fitzstephen understood Celtic society from the inside, while possessing the military training and institutional knowledge that had made Norman expansion so devastatingly effective across Europe. He had spent decades fighting in the Welsh marches, learning how to conquer Celtic kingdoms through a combination of superior technology, administrative efficiency, and psychological warfare. What made this Norman force qualitatively different from anything the Irish had faced before wasn't just their equipment, though their mail hauberks, steel swords and crossbows certainly represented advances over traditional Irish military technology. More importantly, these men fought as a coordinated unit trained to execute complex tactical maneuvers that maximized their advantages while exploiting enemy weaknesses. They understood siege warfare, castle construction, and the systematic administration of conquered territories in ways that would prove decisive against Irish opponents who still relied on traditional Celtic military methods. The Norman approach to conquest was fundamentally different from the Viking model that Ireland had successfully resisted for centuries. where the Norse had sought wealth and glory through raiding and trading, establishing settlements that could coexist with existing Irish political structures. The Normans came as systematic colonizers determined to replace Irish institutions with their own. They didn't want to plunder Irish monasteries or exact tribute from Irish kings. They wanted to become Irish kings themselves, ruling through legal mechanisms and administrative systems that would make their authority permanent and unchallengeable. Fitzstephen's initial objective was limited but strategically crucial: to secure a foothold in Leinster that could serve as a base for larger operations, while demonstrating Norman military superiority to potential Irish allies and enemies alike. Within days of landing, his force had captured the town of Wexford through a perfectly executed combined assault that showcased every aspect of Norman tactical sophistication. While Norman knights charged the main defences, Welsh archers provided covering fire that suppressed Irish resistance, and assault engineers employed siege techniques that quickly breached fortifications, designed to withstand traditional Irish warfare. The speed and completeness of Wexford's fall sent shockwaves across Leinster and beyond. Here was a fortified town that had withstood Viking raids and Irish sieges for generations, reduced to submission in a matter of hours by a force that seemed impossibly small for such an achievement. The psychological impact was perhaps even more important than the military victory, as Irish kings across the island began to reassess their assumptions about Norman capabilities and their own vulnerability to this new form of warfare. Dermot MacMachada, who had remained in hiding during the months following his exile, emerged to join Fitzstephen's force with a mixture of triumph and trepidation that reflected the complexity of his position. He had succeeded in bringing foreign military support to Ireland, but in doing so, he had opened doors that might prove impossible to close again. The Norman adventurers who had answered his call were clearly formidable allies, but they were also potential rivals whose long-term intentions remained unclear. The reunion between Diarmait and his Norman allies marked the beginning of a campaign that would transform the political landscape of southeastern Ireland with remarkable speed. The combined force that now took the field wasn't simply an Irish army reinforced by foreign mercenaries, but rather a new type of military organisation that blended Norman tactical discipline with Irish knowledge of local conditions. Diarmait provided intelligence about enemy strengths and weaknesses, identified potential allies and obstacles, and served as a bridge between Norman commanders and Irish warriors who might otherwise have been suspicious of foreign leadership. The systematic reconquest of Leinster that began in the summer of 1169 proceeded with methodical efficiency that demonstrated every aspect of Norman military superiority. Unlike traditional Irish warfare, which often devolved into cattle raids and individual combat, this campaign was characterized by careful planning, coordinated movement, and strategic objectives that built upon each other toward clear political goals. Each victory opened new opportunities for expansion while consolidating control over previously conquered territories. The Irish forces that opposed this advance found themselves facing tactical challenges they had never encountered before. Norman cavalry charges, delivered by heavily armoured knights on trained war horses, could shatter Irish infantry formations that had proven effective against Viking foot soldiers. Norman archery, employing crossbows and Welsh longbows, could dominate battlefields at ranges that made traditional Irish weapons ineffective. Most devastatingly, Norman siege techniques could reduce Irish fortifications with systematic efficiency that made prolonged resistance impossible. But the Norman advantages weren't purely military. These invaders brought with them administrative and legal concepts that proved equally revolutionary in the Irish context. Where Irish political authority had always been personal and charismatic, dependent on individual relationships between kings and their followers, Norman rule was institutional and bureaucratic, based on written documents and legal procedures that could survive changes in leadership. They established courts, appointed officials, and created records that formalized their authority in ways that Irish tradition had never required or developed. The castle building that accompanied Norman conquest represented perhaps the most visible symbol of this new approach to political control. Unlike the hill forts and ringworks that had characterized Irish defensive architecture for centuries, Norman castles were sophisticated military and administrative centres designed to project power over surrounding territories while providing secure bases for further expansion. The motte and bailey fortifications that began appearing across conquered Leinster weren't just military strongholds, but symbols of permanent occupation that declared Norman intention to stay and rule rather than raid and withdraw. By the autumn of 1169, the success of the initial Norman expedition had attracted additional adventurers from Wales and England who saw opportunities for advancement in Ireland that were no longer available in their increasingly settled homelands. The most significant of these reinforcements was Maurice de Prendergast, another Welsh Norman lord who brought with him additional knights, archers, and siege engineers that more than doubled the size of the Norman force in Ireland. His arrival transformed what had been a limited intervention into the beginning of a major conquest attempt. The expanding Norman presence in Leinster inevitably attracted the attention of Ruaidhrí Wa Conchobar, whose authority as High King of Ireland was directly challenged by the foreign intervention. From his stronghold in Connacht, Ruaidhrí watched with growing alarm as reports reached him of Norman military capabilities and territorial ambitions that far exceeded anything he had anticipated when he originally drove Diarmait into exile. The possibility that these foreign adventurers might establish permanent control over significant portions of Ireland posed threats to his authority that could not be ignored. Ruaidhrí's initial response revealed both his political acumen and his failure to fully comprehend the nature of the challenge he faced. Rather than immediately mounting a military campaign against the Norman invaders, he attempted to resolve the crisis through traditional Irish diplomatic methods, sending envoys to negotiate with Diarmait and his foreign allies. His offer was generous by Irish standards. Diarmait could retain his kingdom of Leinster in exchange for acknowledging Ruaidhrí's supremacy and sending the foreign warriors back across the Irish Sea. But this diplomatic approach, which might have been effective in resolving traditional Irish political disputes, was completely inadequate for dealing with Norman colonial ambitions. Diarmait and his allies had no intention of limiting themselves to the recovery of Leinster. They saw Ireland as a land of unlimited opportunity where determined colonists could carve out territories and establish lordships that would provide wealth and status for generations. The very success of their initial operations had whetted their appetites for further conquests, while demonstrating that Irish resistance was far weaker than they had dared to hope. The arrival of Strongbow himself in August 1170 marked the beginning of the full-scale Norman conquest of Ireland. Richard de Clare came not as a temporary military commander, but as a permanent colonist who intended to establish a dynasty that would rule over Irish territories for centuries to come. His marriage to Diarmait's daughter, Awaif, celebrated amid the ruins of Waterford immediately after its capture, symbolised the fusion of Norman ambition with Irish legitimacy that would characterise the colonial enterprise. Strongbow brought with him the largest Norman force yet seen in Ireland. Over 200 knights, 1,000 archers, and supporting troops that included siege engineers, administrators, and clergy who would establish the institutional framework of Norman rule. This wasn't simply a military expedition, but a complete colonial apparatus designed to replace Irish political structures with Norman alternatives. The systematic nature of this undertaking made it qualitatively different from anything Ireland had previously experienced. The capture of Dublin in September 1170 represented the culmination of Norman military success and the beginning of their administrative consolidation. The city that had served as the centre of Viking power in Ireland for over 3 centuries fell to Norman assault in a single day, its defenders overwhelmed by siege techniques and tactical coordination that they had no effective means of countering. More importantly, the speed of Dublin's fall demonstrated to Irish observers that traditional defensive methods were obsolete against Norman military technology. The Norman occupation of Dublin had implications that extended far beyond military conquest. As Ireland's largest and wealthiest city, Dublin controlled trade routes that connected the island to Europe and beyond. Its capture gave the Normans access to resources and commercial networks that would finance further expansion, while depriving Irish kings of revenues they had traditionally used to maintain their own military forces. The transformation of Dublin from a Viking trading centre into a Norman administrative capital marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power across Ireland. But the very success of Norman expansion also created new vulnerabilities that astute Irish leaders began to exploit. The rapid territorial gains that had characterized the initial conquest had stretched Norman forces across vast areas, making them vulnerable to coordinated Irish resistance that could exploit their overextension. More importantly, the death of Diarmait Mac Murchada in May 1171 removed the Irish legitimacy that had provided legal justification for Norman presence in Ireland, creating opportunities for Irish kings to challenge foreign rule through both military and diplomatic means. Ruaidhrí's response to these developments demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Irish resistance to Norman conquest. The High King assembled the largest Irish army since Clontarf, drawing contingents from every kingdom that acknowledged his authority while appealing to traditional Irish hostility toward foreign invasion. This force represented the military might of a united Ireland, equipped with weapons and tactics that had been refined through centuries of conflict with Vikings and rival Irish kingdoms. The Siege of Dublin, that began in the summer of 1171, marked the first serious Irish challenge to Norman conquest, and would determine whether foreign rule could be established permanently in Ireland, or whether it would prove to be merely another failed invasion like those that had preceded it. The outcome of this confrontation would shape Irish history for centuries to come, determining whether Ireland would remain an independent Celtic nation or become another province of the expanding Angevin Empire. The forces that faced each other across the walls of Dublin represented two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, politics, and social organisation. The Irish army that surrounded the city embodied centuries of Celtic military tradition, fighting for concepts of freedom and independence that had sustained Irish resistance to foreign domination since ancient times. The Norman defenders represented a new form of colonial enterprise that combined military superiority with institutional sophistication in ways that posed unprecedented challenges to traditional Irish society. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the immediate fate of Norman expansion in Ireland, but the long-term character of Irish civilization itself. The lessons learned during centuries of Viking warfare would be tested against an enemy that employed very different methods and pursued very different objectives than any foreign force that Ireland had previously encountered. The siege that unfolded around Dublin's walls in the summer of 1171 would become one of the defining moments in Irish history, though not in the way that Ruaidhrí Ua Conchobar had envisioned when he assembled his great army. The Irish forces that surrounded the Norman-held city were impressive by any standard. Perhaps 15,000 warriors drawn from every corner of the island, representing a unity of purpose that hadn't been seen since Brian Boru's campaigns. Yet for all their numbers and determination, they faced an enemy that had spent generations perfecting the art of defensive warfare in hostile territories. The Normans trapped within Dublin's walls weren't the desperate garrison that Ruaidhrí expected to find. Under Strongbow's leadership, they had spent months transforming the Viking city into a fortress that could withstand extended siege. They had strengthened the existing walls, constructed new defensive works, and stockpiled supplies sufficient to last through a winter of blockade. Most importantly, they had established communication lines with Norman forces still holding other strongholds across Leinster, creating a network of mutual support that could sustain resistance indefinitely. What the Irish army discovered as the siege progressed was that Norman defensive tactics were as revolutionary as their offensive capabilities had proven to be. Where traditional Irish warfare relied on heroic individual combat and the psychological impact of massed charges, Norman defense was methodical and systematic. Every arrow shot from the walls was carefully aimed, every sortie precisely timed to achieve maximum effect while minimizing casualties. The defenders fought not for personal glory, but for collective survival, coordinating their efforts in ways that made their smaller numbers far more effective than Irish tactical traditions suggested should be possible. The siege dragged on through the autumn months, becoming a test of endurance that favoured the better supplied and more disciplined Norman forces. Irish warriors, accustomed to short campaigns followed by returns to their farms and families, began to drift away as the harvest season demanded their attention at home. The coalition that Ruaidhrí had assembled with such difficulty slowly disintegrated under the pressures of time, distance, and the practical necessities of agricultural life. But the ultimate factor that doomed the Irish siege wasn't military, but political. In October 1171, ships appeared in Dublin Bay, flying banners that struck fear into Norman and Irish hearts alike. The royal standard of Henry II, King of England. The Angevin monarch had finally decided to intervene personally in Irish affairs, bringing with him an army that dwarfed both the Norman garrison and the Irish besiegers. His arrival transformed what had been a struggle between Irish kingdoms and Norman adventurers into a confrontation between Ireland and one of medieval Europe's most powerful monarchs. Henry's intervention in Ireland wasn't driven primarily by concern for Strongbow's predicament, though the protection of his vassals provided convenient justification for his actions. The English king had been watching developments in Ireland with growing unease, recognizing that the success of Norman colonization there could create autonomous lordships that might challenge royal authority. By asserting direct control over the conquest, Henry could ensure that Irish territories would be held as fiefs of the English crown, rather than independent principalities. The massive royal expedition that landed at Waterford represented a level of military organisation that neither Norman adventurers nor Irish kings could match. Henry brought with him not just soldiers, but an entire apparatus of government, clerks, judges, administrators and engineers who would establish English royal authority on a permanent basis. This wasn't simply another medieval army, but the institutional machinery of conquest, designed to transform military victory into lasting political control. The psychological impact of Henry's arrival was devastating for Irish morale. Ruaidhrí's great army, already weakened by months of fruitless siege warfare, began to melt away as Irish kings calculated the futility of resisting such overwhelming force. The High King himself, recognizing that further military resistance would only bring destruction upon his people, reluctantly opened negotiations with the English monarch. The Treaty of Windsor, signed in 1175, marked the formal end of Irish independence and the beginning of 7 centuries of English rule. The terms were deceptively moderate, allowing Ruaidhrí to retain the title of High King while acknowledging Henry as his overlord. Irish kings who submitted to English authority would be permitted to keep their territories, provided they paid tribute and accepted English legal supremacy. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable compromise that preserved Irish dignity while acknowledging political reality. But the treaty's real significance lay in its transformation of Ireland from an independent nation into a colonial territory. The English crown now claimed ultimate authority over Irish affairs, with the right to intervene in disputes, impose taxes, and establish settlements wherever royal interests demanded. The gradual implementation of English law, English administrative systems, and English colonial practices would slowly strangle Irish political autonomy, even as native rulers retained their titles and ceremonial functions. The Norman lords who had initiated the conquest found themselves in an ambiguous position under the new royal regime. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in carving out territories and establishing lordships, but their independence was now constrained by royal oversight that limited their freedom of action. Strongbow, in particular, discovered that his spectacular military achievements had earned him royal suspicion rather than royal favour, as Henry questioned the loyalty of vassals who had proven capable of conquering kingdoms on their own initiative. The decades that followed the Treaty of Windsor witnessed the systematic transformation of Irish society under English colonial rule. Norman settlers, protected by royal authority and supported by institutional structures that the original adventurers had lacked, spread across the island in waves that gradually displaced traditional Irish landholding patterns. The great Irish kingdoms that had dominated the political landscape for centuries were either absorbed into the colonial administration or marginalised into increasingly remote territories. The colonisation process that unfolded was more thorough and devastating than anything Ireland had experienced during the Viking Age. Where Norse settlers had largely adapted to Irish social structures while adding their own commercial and urban elements, Norman colonists came with the explicit intention of replacing Irish institutions with English alternatives. They established manor houses instead of ring forts, introduced feudal land tenure instead of Gaelic clan ownership, and imposed English legal procedures instead of traditional Irish law. The cultural impact of Norman colonisation was equally profound. The Irish language, which had absorbed Norse vocabulary while remaining essentially Celtic in character, now faced systematic pressure from Anglo-Norman French and Latin, the languages of government, law, and high culture. Irish artistic traditions were displaced by continental European styles, while Irish literary forms gave way to French chansons and Latin chronicles. The great monastic schools that had made Ireland famous across medieval Europe found themselves competing with cathedral schools and universities that followed continental educational models. Yet Irish resistance to cultural assimilation proved remarkably resilient, even as political resistance crumbled before superior English organisation and resources. In the remote western regions that remained outside direct English control, traditional Irish society continued to function much as it had for centuries. Gaelic lords maintained their ancient customs, Irish poets preserved their literary traditions, and Celtic Christianity retained its distinctive characteristics. This cultural persistence, despite pressure from English ecclesiastical reforms, created a unique dynamic in medieval Ireland that would shape the island's history for centuries to come. As Norman settlers established themselves in the more fertile eastern regions, they gradually absorbed Irish customs and perspectives. Through intermarriage, economic necessity, and simple proximity to Gaelic culture. Within a few generations, many Norman families had become more Irish than the Irish themselves, adopting Gaelic names, Irish legal practices, and Celtic social customs that horrified English administrators trying to maintain colonial discipline. The phenomenon of Norman Hibernicization created a complex three-way cultural dynamic that defied simple categorization. The English government in Dublin attempted to maintain strict separation between colonial settlers and native Irish, passing legislation that prohibited intermarriage, cultural exchange, and the adoption of Irish customs by English subjects. But the practical realities of life in a predominantly Irish environment made such separation impossible to maintain, leading to the emergence of a hybrid Anglo-Irish culture that was neither fully English nor purely Irish. The great Irish families who had survived the initial conquest found themselves navigating an increasingly complex political landscape where traditional concepts of loyalty, authority, and identity no longer provided clear guidance. Some, like the descendants of Brian Boru in Munster, chose accommodation with English rule, accepting colonial lordships that allowed them to retain much of their ancestral territories, while acknowledging English overlordship. Others retreated to the western margins of the island, where they maintained independent Gaelic lordships that existed in perpetual tension with colonial authority. The ecclesiastical dimension of the conquest proved particularly significant for long-term cultural development. The English Crown's determination to bring the Irish Church into conformity with continental European practices led to systematic reforms that replaced Irish monastic traditions with English diocesan structures. Ancient monasteries that had preserved Irish learning for centuries were either dissolved or transformed into conventional European religious houses, while Irish clerics were gradually replaced by English appointees who implemented reforms designed to eliminate distinctive Irish practices. Yet the spiritual traditions that had flourished during Ireland's Golden Age proved impossible to eradicate entirely. Irish pilgrimage sites continued to attract devotees from across Europe. Irish manuscripts preserved ancient texts that would otherwise have been lost, and Irish theological traditions influenced European scholastic development in ways that English administrators never fully appreciated. The synthesis of Celtic spirituality with continental Christian orthodoxy that had characterized early Irish Christianity persisted in modified forms throughout the medieval period. The economic transformation of Ireland under Norman rule was equally dramatic, but more immediately visible than cultural changes. The introduction of feudal agricultural practices, commercial law, and urban planning transformed an economy that had remained essentially pastoral for centuries. New crops, new farming techniques, and new forms of land organization increased agricultural productivity dramatically, supporting population growth that would have been impossible under traditional Irish economic systems. The expansion of towns and cities under Norman auspices created opportunities for trade and craftsmanship that attracted both English colonists and Irish natives seeking economic advancement. Dublin grew from a modest Viking trading centre into one of medieval Europe's significant commercial hubs, while new towns like New Ross, Kilkenny, and Drogheda emerged as regional centres that connected Ireland to continental European markets. The wealth generated by this economic transformation financed the construction of castles, cathedrals, and administrative buildings that proclaimed English dominance while providing employment for Irish craftsmen and labourers. But this economic modernisation came at enormous cost to traditional Irish society. The clan-based landholding systems that had sustained Irish communities for centuries were gradually replaced by feudal arrangements that concentrated ownership in the hands of Norman lords and English officials. Irish farmers who had once enjoyed customary rights to their ancestral lands found themselves reduced to tenant status, working fields that their families had cultivated for generations but no longer owned. The displacement of traditional Irish elites from positions of economic authority created resentments that would fuel resistance for centuries to come. The military dimension of English rule in Ireland required constant vigilance and periodic reinforcement that drained royal resources while never achieving complete security. The Irish lords who had submitted to English authority often proved unreliable allies who might switch sides whenever political circumstances seemed favourable. The complex geography of Ireland, with its forests, bogs, and mountains, provided ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare that English conventional military superiority couldn't easily counter. Most problematically, the gradual Hibernicization of Norman settlers created security concerns that forced English administrators to treat their own colonists with suspicion. The administrative challenges of governing Ireland proved equally intractable, as English legal and governmental systems struggled to adapt to Irish conditions. The elaborate feudal hierarchies that functioned smoothly in England became confused and contradictory when applied to Irish territories, where traditional clan loyalties cut across formal feudal obligations. English common law competed with Irish Brehon law in ways that created jurisdictional disputes that could escalate into armed conflicts. The attempt to impose English administrative uniformity on a society that had developed very different institutional traditions generated constant friction that undermined colonial effectiveness. By the end of the 13th century, the English conquest of Ireland had achieved remarkable success in transforming the island's political, economic, and social structures. Yet it had also created problems that would plague English rule for centuries to come. The very thoroughness of Norman colonization had generated Irish resistance that took forms English administrators couldn't easily predict or counter. The cultural assimilation of Norman settlers had created a colonial population whose loyalty to English interests was increasingly questionable. Most ominously, the emergence of a distinctive Anglo-Irish identity suggested that Ireland might develop into an autonomous lordship that challenged rather than supported English royal authority. The Ireland that emerged from 2 centuries of English colonisation was neither the independent Celtic nation that had existed before the Norman invasion, nor the compliant English colony that royal administrators had envisioned. Instead, it had become something unprecedented in medieval European experience. A hybrid society where English institutional forms coexisted uneasily with Irish cultural traditions, where Norman military technology served Gaelic political objectives, and where colonial settlers gradually transformed into a new kind of Irish nobility that would challenge both English authority and Gaelic tradition. The stage was now set for the next great chapter in Irish history, one that would witness the gradual emergence of Irish national consciousness as a political force capable of challenging English rule. The cultural synthesis that had occurred during the early centuries of colonisation would provide the intellectual and emotional foundations for resistance movements that would eventually transform Ireland from an English colony into an independent nation. But that transformation would require centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and adaptation that would test every lesson Ireland had learned during its long and turbulent history. From those first tentative footsteps of Mesolithic hunters, crossing ancient land bridges to the complex political struggles of medieval Ireland, this extraordinary island has witnessed humanity's greatest triumphs and most devastating tragedies. Through ice ages and invasions, golden ages and dark centuries, the Irish story reveals something profound about the human spirit's capacity to endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail against impossible odds. The threads we followed, from megalithic astronomers to Viking raiders, from Celtic warriors to Norman colonizers, all weave together to create a tapestry of resilience that continues to inspire the world today.